Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. We are really thrilled that you were able to join us today for this complimentary webinar that we put together, navigating the crossroads of the Clery Act, the VAWA Amendments, and the White House Task Force report. We're really thrilled that you can join us. We've had some questions about the slides. We will email these slides out to you, along with a recording of this webinar. Also, we've only given ourselves an hour as kind of a quick learning or quick action step type of presentation. If you have additional questions and you don't have the time to ask all of your questions, because I believe we have close to 600 registrants on this webinar, you are always welcome to contact the Clery Center, to contact me directly. My email is on the end of this. We also have our Twitter and Facebook up there, so you can tweet at us if that's your preferred method of communication. So please note that you can contact us in any way possible. We will be checking the chat and question features. However, I will tell you that given the large number of folks on this, we may not get to every question. And if we miss your question, please know that it is not intentional. So the impetus for this presentation today was kind of what we see as the White House Task Force report that we saw come out, the Not Alone, the first report of the White House Task Force, kind of in tandem with the consensus reached on April 1st for the draft regulations for the Violence Against Women Act amendment to the Clery Act. We have certainly seen the landscape change, and we'll talk about that a little bit as the presentation goes on. But for that reason, we think given our role being a service provider, a nonprofit organization, advocating for campus safety for 27 years, we really wanted to give some of our thoughts and what we have seen through our work to help you guide your work. We're going to connect some of what was in that White House Task Force to the requirements of the VAWA Amendment, so you can see some of those intersections, and then provide you with some resources at the end of the show today. So the landscape today, if anyone walked by a news shelf more recently, you've probably seen the new Time magazine cover, or maybe last week's Time magazine cover, focusing on rape and sexual assault on campus. We have certainly seen a lot of action on Capitol Hill for proposed legislation, some that we may agree with, some we may not agree with, and student activism, a lot of social media attention looking at violence against women on college and university campuses. And in our role at the Clery Center, we also serve as a technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women. So we've been doing a lot of work with some of our colleagues who provide technical assistance to help both current campus grantees and then some of the work that we've been doing with non-grantees. So others who are trying their best to comply with legislation, with laws, but also to look at what has come out of the White House Task Force. We also recognize, too, that a lot of the attention that has been around this issue has been negative attention. So it has been students who are reporting possible noncompliance by their universities and looking at what could be going wrong. What we spend a lot of time focusing on, too, with some of the campuses with whom we work is what's going well? What are we doing right? What are some action steps that we can take? And we recognize in our role of training technical assistants, working both with members of our collaborative learning program, that there are institutions getting it right. And so we want those institutions and some of you who are doing that to really feel empowered to share that and to be proud of the work that you're doing. So an overview of Not Alone, what we got from the Not Alone report, that first task force report, they did a number of conversations with stakeholders, both students, faculty, staff, administrators at colleges and universities, external advocacy groups. And so some of the key recommendations that we pulled from that report were suggestions to do campus climate surveys, prevention education and engaging men in prevention on college and university campuses, effective response, and then increasing transparency and enforcement. So based on the Not Alone report, we're planning for the next few steps of this to look at the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act, because they certainly intersect, or there are crossroads between the Not Alone report and the new VAWA amendments. as well as to what you're already doing for Clery compliance. So the goal of this webinar today is to really we'll go through some of that background of the Clery Act, because I think given the VAWA amendments, we've also heard from some folks in trainings that they were not as aware of the elements of the Clery Act. They thought that was in the wheelhouse of campus police only. So for some of you doing prevention education, for doing work on violence against women around prevention and advocacy, I think it's great to kind of get that baseline knowledge of Clery compliance so we can go forward and look at how we can best comply with the VAWA amendments and with Not Alone. So some of the history of the Clery Act, and we always find it important in our presentations to talk about why we're here. So Howard and Connie Clery, following the rape and murder of their daughter, Jeanne, by another student whom they did not know, really started this crusade with state laws and eventually the Clery Act. And there are times where the technical elements of the Clery Act can get confusing, and we work with institutions to really kind of declutter that confusion and understand how to implement Clery. We also go beyond the letter of the law and embrace the spirit of the law. And the last picture is Connie, and I'm not someone who crosses personal boundaries, but I brought one of my new daughters to meet Connie. And, seeing Connie holding my daughter reminded me that she should be a grandmother. She didn't want to do this. This was not a choice of hers. Anybody would want to still have their child. So I think it's important to take us back to this place and recognize, why are we here? What do we need to do? And so my intention here today is to go over, as I said, the basics of the Clery Act, look at their connection, the connection of the Clery Act with the VAWA amendments, and then also how that intersects with what we learned from the first White House Task Force report. You're going to see some slides throughout this presentation that have action steps. As an organization that really prides itself on being solutions focused, I wanted to give you some solutions, and they may not fit your campus, but which is why I gave you some multiple options for that. And so as we go through this, you will get those slides, and I'll really highlight some of the suggestions that we've seen, both as best and promising practices. So starting with the Jeanne Clery Act, the elements of the Jeanne Clery Act are the annual security report, and that includes statements of policy. So essentially the cliff notes of your full policies. Some of those policies, for the purposes of this webinar, I'll focus on the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, or policies around sex offenses, which is the language that Clery uses. That's the area, say, of your policy statement where you may have a full policy that the policy statement supports that may need to be changed. One, to make that good faith effort for the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. And two, if you want to integrate any pieces of Title IX or of the White House Task Force, and depending on if your sex offense policy is also your sexual misconduct policy, that's an institutional decision. We're also going to talk about ongoing disclosures, which include emergency notification if there's an immediate threat to any student safety, timely warning if there's a Clery crime that's committed within the Clery Geography, evaluating if a warning needs to go out. And so around sexual violence, sexual assault falls into a Clery crime. And, often I think the key piece is to evaluate every Clery crime for whether or not a warning should go out. Often there may be this belief that you have to warn for every crime, and that's not the case. It's a current or ongoing threat to student safety. And you also want to be careful that you don't identify a victim in that warning. So for every campus, it's going to be really, discretion will need to come into play every time you determine whether or not to issue that warning. The maintenance of a public crime log is another part of the ongoing disclosures. And then the Department of Education enforces the Clery Act. So they are the organization that, through financial aid, because it's a consumer protection bill, that enforces or does program reviews on the Clery Act. And a lot of what we find, or challenges that we find with Clery compliance, come not only from our work directly with institutions, but from content analysis of some of those program review reports. Some more on the law. It was originally passed in 1990 as a Student Right to Know and Campus Security Act. The Clery Act was amended more in 1992. That was the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights. 1998, 2008, which was able to include the emergency notification requirements. And then most recently in 2013 with the VAWA Amendments. The final rules, or the most recent rules that we have, are from 2009, but those will certainly change when we have the final rules for the VAWA Amendments, which is predicted to be probably sometime around the beginning of November. The Clery crimes that I mentioned earlier. So we listed what the Clery Act crimes are, and we're going to see some changes around sex offenses, where we'll be moving away from that forcible, non-forcible sex offenses and becoming, and again, this is what we see in the draft regulations for the VAWA amendments. When those become final, we will see those change in our crime statistic reporting. Hate crimes, we're also seeing an expansion of hate crimes as well with the VAWA amendments. Clery Geography is another kind of term that's Clery specific. So for Clery crimes, we talk about on-campus crimes, so that's owned, controlled by the university on the main campus. Non-campus crimes, which are not reasonably contiguous, which is a Clery term, but it may be a building that where you hold classes, an athletic facility, but it's not within that kind of 2-mile radius of campus. And so it's considered non-campus. Some of your abroad locations may also be considered non-campus. And then public property, which is another piece. Right now, you may choose to use a map or list, but in the new VAWA amendments, it's also requiring to have that map that many of you have already to let stakeholders know what your Clery geography is. It's important to note in the Clery geography that when you have reports of sexual assault, the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, you still have obligations to respond if it's not in your geography. It may not be the law enforcement response, but the student conduct process certainly, and a lot of that intersects with Title IX and what you're required to do under Title IX. Campus security authorities is another key area that we talk about. And so campus security authorities are people who are required to report crimes when they're reported to them. And I think it's important to note that campus security authorities are not only reporting a statistic, that's one element, but they also have to consider when a crime is reported, as soon as they hear about it, to get that information of public safety or campus police, so they can evaluate if a timely warning needs to go out. So you need to develop a protocol for your campus security authorities. Most notably, anybody with significant responsibility for student and campus activities outside of the classroom. So that's most of your student life folks, coaches, resident assistants. You really want to be sure that you have a system in place to train those people on what their obligations are, and so they know how to get those statistics forward. One of the things the White House Task Force addresses is kind of this confidentiality piece, and we also saw it in the frequently asked questions for Title IX. And one of the elements that they identified was, allowing more people to be confidential resources. And that's an area where, to be quite honest, I think it's a matter of making sure your campus knows who the confidential resources are on your campus. Being very transparent about that, making sure to advertise where they can go for confidential assistance. And also knowing for people on campus to know that they are confidential resources. You don't want somebody who does not have privilege to indicate that they're confidential, or a conversation can be confidential if it in fact cannot by law. So that's an area where you really want to go through and look at what you have in place already before you go and start designating other folks as confidential resources. Something that's important to understand is the Campus Sexual Assault Victim Bill of Rights, which I included here. One, you're required to have educational programs to prevent sex offenses. Those are going to change or evolve through the statute for VAWA and also with the draft regulations. And I'm going to go through what the difference is of making that good faith effort versus coming into complete compliance. The other pieces and the R's with the circle on these slides indicate that these are required by law. So procedures to follow when a sex offense is reported, options to notify law enforcement, change of on or off campus living situations, change of academic situations, change of living situations, notification of on or off campus services. You are not required to change off campus housing situations if you have no control over that property or it's not owned by the institution. But you have to let students know where the on and off campus services are. And then you do change, if reasonably possible, academic situations or living situations. So that can be their campus housing residence hall, if they're somewhere near the accused student, or if for some reason they want to switch the room because maybe the attack happened there and there's some trauma associated with that, you want to make sure that's clear. Campus disciplinary procedures, and in some of the VAWA amendments, we'll talk more about that. And then sanctions following a final determination. And this is an area where the sub-regulatory guidance for the Clery Act, or the handbook, and many of you know the handbook for campus crime reporting, has said since 2005 that we need to include a list of all potential sanctions. And I've heard mixed opinions on this. I can tell you that it's also in the 2011 handbook for campus crime reporting to list all possible sanctions. So if you're listing a range now, you really want to consider going back and reviewing what that guidance is and what your obligations are. So the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. This is a part I really am happy to spend some time on, and I think it's important as we get into the meat of the presentation to connect this to what some of the White House task force said. For two reasons. One, there certainly is a connection, and because I think there's a lot of anxiety around these amendments right now. Some of that comes from, we often hear unfunded mandate, and that, unless you have a grant that you've been awarded to implement these, it's challenging. But I really suggest that you take pause and step back and look at what you're doing already. If dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking happens on your campus, you've probably, unfortunately, had to deal with this already. So what are some systems that are in place? Or how can what you're doing already kind of pair with what you do for reported sexual violence now? It was signed into law on March 7th, 2013. This is going to expand to cover students and staff of institutions. So if you've not already been engaging with human resources, you should be. Now's the best time. Now more than ever, they should be involved in what you're doing for Clery. And it's the most dramatic expansion to sexual violence reporting and policy since the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, which was the 92 amendments to the Clery Act. So the U.S. Department of Education issued preliminary guidance. And I want to reiterate that. The U.S. Department of Education issued preliminary guidance. This is not from the Clery Center. This is not from other consultants. There are a lot of, having been in this field for almost a decade, there's been quite a bit of change in the last 5 years. There are a lot of players out there, which is great because there needs to be a lot of people supporting missions of campus safety. That being said, I think it's important to note that the negotiator rulemaking process has to happen with changes to the Clery Act. And we do not have final regulations yet. We only have draft regulations based on the consensus. What that means is the regulations will not be final until possibly November of this year. So for this year's annual security report, you have to make a good faith effort to include statistics for the 2013 calendar year. The good faith effort means you have to try. You may not get everything perfectly this time, and you are not expected to. There was a letter from the Department of Education on May 29th of 2013. We have it listed on our website. It's very clear that you are just making this good faith effort. I recently sat on a panel with some of the enforcement team from the Department of Education. And they understand that some of your institutions cannot change policy in a month or even from April until October, that you need to go through many channels. So what you need to do in this year's annual security report is really just include, if you don't have everything completed, what you're doing to make that effort, how you plan to get there, how you plan to revise your policy. Maybe you have an interim policy. You also, if you are looking at educational systems to put into place, do not sign a contract to buy something for 5 years if you don't know it will work for you. Even the draft regulations have not been prescriptive about what will work. So you really have to think less about how you get in compliance very quickly and more about what's going to work best for your institution to comply with these new regulations. And again, the landscape that I went over earlier makes it or gives it this sense of urgency. We have the White House paying attention to this. We have many students across the country paying attention to this. And it's great that it has that attention. However, there doesn't have to be this urgent, you want to be thoughtful about the steps that you take for compliance. Some of the highlights of Section 304 of the Violence Against Women Act. I think it's important to note that it's the Violence Against Women Act amendments to Clery. Campus Save actually didn't pass. This has informally been known as Campus Save because Section 304 of the Violence Against Women Act contains many of the elements that Campus Save had. However, the law itself, Campus Save, was a standalone bill. So what happened was some of it got wrapped up in the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. And we've often heard from people, what's the difference between the Clery Act and Campus Save? And the difference is there is no difference. The elements of Save that are in the Violence Against Women Act are the amendments to Clery. So I think it's important to be clear about what those differences are. We're adding domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. We are adding prevention and awareness programs. So there has been a look at the 1992 amendments to the Clery Act required programs, but it didn't talk about what types of programs or that you had to evaluate. So how that translated is a lot of institutions did programs that didn't work or may not have worked to check off that compliance box. So now what we're saying is, okay, you're doing these programs, but let's take it a step further and do things that either we have evidence are working or that you're going to evaluate to see if they work. Procedures to follow for filing a complaint or a complaint within your institution. Information in writing, so providing students and staff, faculty, if they report, with information of these things in writing. So they have it if they decide down the road to either notify law enforcement or change a living situation. Also expanding on academic and living to transportation and work situations, because now we're talking about the issue of domestic violence in the workplace. The option to notify law enforcement, campus disciplinary procedures, and then sanctions following a final determination. So you'll notice some of these elements of the VAWA are just really updating the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights. So now I want to talk about the crossroads. So the crossroads of the 9/11 report specific to Clery compliance, because there are certainly crossroads in the dynamics of sexual violence in Title IX, but we want to talk specifically about Clery and the VAWA amendments to Clery. And so the key areas that I'm going to focus on are prevention, trauma-informed training for administrators, improved disciplinary systems, and partnerships within the community. So starting with prevention, one of the things the White House Task Force highlighted was this need for comprehensive prevention. And it highlighted the need for evaluation, so evaluating your prevention and engaging men. The VAWA amendments to the Clery Act will require evidence-based prevention and or consistent evaluation of prevention programs. So what the statute says is that you have to look at primary prevention, bystander intervention. How the draft regulations ironed out were this statement, that it's going to require evidence-based prevention and or consistent evaluation, which gives you some leeway if you cannot invest in something that's evidence-based, that has strong evidence and research behind it. It's requiring that whatever you put in place on your campus, that you're evaluating consistently. And that evaluation, you could get buy-in from faculty to help you with that. If you have health education professionals on your campus or health and wellness professionals, they can most likely help you with that. It may be simply a SurveyMonkey tool, but you really want to make sure if you're not employing the evidence-based programs that we know about, that you're constantly evaluating your program. These are some of the pieces from the statute. So this is what you're basing your good faith effort on. Looking at primary prevention and awareness programs for incoming and new employees. And it was very clear at the negotiated rulemaking meetings that the Department of Education is not going to be able to enforce how you reach everyone. They're not going to be able to ask for a list and ask and make sure you reached every person on your campus. What they are going to be able to enforce is whether or not you have these programs available for incoming students and new employees, how you're making them available. And then these are the other elements you want to look at for your good faith effort, your policy. Do you have a statement that you prohibit offenses of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking? You probably have that statement right now about sexual violence. You just need to expand it. The definition of the crimes, definition of consent, safe and positive options for bystander intervention to prevent, and informations on risk reduction. There is nothing in there that says you have to buy a new program, engage in a new program, sign a contract. What it says is you want to look at ongoing prevention and awareness campaigns. Sit with a group, make a strategic plan for how we are going to approach educational programs a year-by-year basis. What are some things that are working? If you're the person responsible for Clery now and you're running this on your own, engage other people on your campus who may be doing this, who may have been running programs on stalking but haven't reported to you about this. Try to find out what types of programs are going on your campus. And so here are my action steps. Identify what you have already. Before you buy something, before you engage in something, look at what you're doing already. And even if you think you know, reach out to the departments that you know do education. Find out if your athletic department does something, if your Greek life department does something. If you have something that can work through your sociology department, through health promotion department if you have that on campus. The first thing you should do if you have not done so already, as soon as we end this program, is hang up the computer or phone and call your local victim service organization or rape crisis or domestic violence center. Our local centers, I've talked to folks from the national representation of these groups as well as from state coalitions. They are more than willing to help as best they can. And they can help with trainings. They can help with materials. They can help with some evidence-based practices. And they often have funding to work with you or partner with you. They work many times in K through 12 institutions. And often, and I say this as someone who worked at one of those centers, are really craving to work with colleges and universities and to get in the door to connect with professionals at colleges and universities. Don't make rash decisions to contract with an outside vendor. And I say that we work as well with a lot of outside companies, for-profit companies that do a tremendous amount of research and create great products. But you want to make sure the product makes sense for you. Engage students in those decisions. You don't have to make these decisions for this year's annual security report. You just have to think about how you're going to do it and start to implement something. I often say if you're strapped on resources, but you have support, meaning supportive leadership, try to do something homegrown. See if you can create something that works for your campus and your culture. The task force talked about doing a climate survey. Only your campus knows your campus and climate the best. So you also know what may work, and some products may not work for your institution. And if you have not already done so, create a compliance committee. Engage the Women's Center, engage the Advocacy Center, engage whoever is doing the alcohol, drug, and wellness education. Engage campus police, student conduct, if you can get interested faculty, human resources. Bring a group together. Clery compliance with this. If you're the Title IX coordinator, the Clery coordinator, or both, as well as wearing many other hats, you can't do this alone. So you really need to bring a committee together to help you work on this and to work well through this. The White House Task Force talked about trauma-informed training. So really understanding or training administrators, training law enforcement, so they understand a trauma-informed approach to disciplinary systems. So the VAWA amendments also include provisions that address training student conduct administrators on the dynamics of victimization. I had a colleague with whom I worked who was a student conduct officer. And in training, she talked about what her role was in working with survivors and victims. And my response back to her was, she's not an advocate. There are other people who serve that role. Her job is to make the hearing fair, prompt, impartial. So you want to make sure that student conduct administrators and boards understand the dynamics. And they also have to understand that they're not required to become victim advocates, but they can certainly understand how trauma can affect us all differently, and that we don't all end up in a corner crying. Some may not, so that everybody's response is different. So some of the policy statements that are also included through VAWA are making sure that students and employees are provided with written explanation of their rights. So you want to think about what this looks like. Right now, we're supposed to be telling a student or staff member when they report that they have rights and explaining what those rights are. Now you're going to have to do this in writing. So thinking about that, will this be an email communication? Will this be a hard copy communication? And it seems that there'll be some discretion in how we do this. So you need to think on your campus, what's the best way to communicate this information, and to consistently make sure we're communicating it to anybody who reports. If we look at distributing our annual security reports under Clery, we have options for doing that as well. So maybe think about it in that way. Are we going to have a standard email that goes out? Are we going to have a hard piece of paper? Will we have both? And how do we make sure that student gets it? I think for a best practice, I would encourage handing the hard paper, but also doing a follow-up email. So you know that the student got that information. And this is a trauma-informed approach, because it's going to affect everyone differently, and people may not be ready when they report to make decisions. So it gives them the opportunity to look back at what their options were, because they may not remember. Procedures for the disciplinary process. You want to make sure that it's prompt, fair, impartial, investigation and resolution. And you'll certainly see some connection to what we see in Title IX there. You want to make sure that the officials who are conducting this get annual training. That annual training can be in partnership with your local crisis center, where they talk about the dynamics of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking. They talk about sexual assault and working with some of their clients and what they see. You may talk to folks who talk about how to conduct an investigation and how to conduct a hearing process. This is something, too, that you can work with maybe other local institutions on. What do you do? How can we, as a group, share kind of some of our processes or help one another? So our action steps. You want to create a plan for training. And again, making that good faith effort. So create a plan for training your hearing board. See if it works, and evaluate if it doesn't, what changes you will make. And maybe that is contracting with someone outside to do that training. Maybe it is partnering with another university or a university down the street to see if you could do that training together. Evaluate your policies for compliance with legal requirements. Look at what you have now before you go back to the drawing board. Look at what you have now and start to see how you can change or make that good faith effort to amend with what the VAWA amendments are saying. Understand the role of each person in the process. And I said this earlier, if you have a student, the student conduct person is not an advocate. Who do you have identified as advocates for reporting students, for survivors? Who do you have identified for that accused student? Because they need support in this process too. So you want to make sure you have people identified who can support, and choices. You want to understand what the options will be if students do bring outside advisors. If those advisors are legal counsel, how much do you want them to participate? Can they only sit in the room? And so you really want to be sure. And one of the best ways to do this is to develop case studies for, and do that formally on your campus or informally with a consortium of other college campuses. I think it's a great way to partner with other campuses and to understand and share some practices that are working, to partner with like universities and to share some practices that are working. We have the Association of Student Conduct Administrators, International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, both of whom we've collaborated with a number of times. And they have formal associations, National Associations of Students Personnel Administrators, NASPA, has a campus safety knowledge community, as well as other knowledge communities where you can really connect with like-minded professionals and share. One of the greatest things about the higher education community is that there is quite a bit of sharing going on. Partnerships. So Not Alone identifies the benefits of developing community partnerships for both prevention and response. And this is something too in the VAWA Amendments to Clery Act. We talk about disclosing if you have memorandums of understanding, not only with other law enforcement or local law enforcement, but with local victim service, rape crisis centers, domestic violence agencies. And so really understanding how you work with those organizations. You may have a wonderful counseling center, but it makes sense to offer other options. Offer off-campus services as well. Develop some sort of relationship so students can go for crisis counseling outside of your campus. And again, depending on the size, small or large, and even if it's large, they may want to go off. But certainly if it's a smaller institution that, it's very easy to know everyone on campus very quickly, the student may want to go somewhere where they feel safer. Even though your centers may be safe, you want to provide other options and not make the decision for the survivor. So some of the action steps you need to talk about or think about is what level or extent do we have on our campus, and what are the range of the programs we have, both educational programs, both in responding, and then identify where do we need to build some collaborative partnerships? Where can we get help from other organizations to respond to students and faculty and staff? You want to look at how qualified your staff is to do crisis counseling or to do long-term therapeutic counseling, or both. Do they offer crisis, maybe a one-time session in crisis, and ongoing sessions, 2 to 3? Do they offer long-term therapeutic services? And many counseling centers are certainly overburdened, so they may not have the staff and support to offer long-term. So where can students be sent? Do we have hotlines either on campus or run off? Do we have facilities for confidential services? What liability concerns may come up? And you want to consider that. Consider if there are conflict in roles. If someone who's identified as an advocate for a reporting student is also going to work with an accused student, how does that make sense? Is that possible? Identify existing services. So really look at the services you have. And I mean simply creating a list or a spreadsheet. What's the quality? Are we evaluating the services we have? Are students, staff, faculty getting what they need from the services? Where do we have needs? So have we noticed, for example, on our campus, a growth in the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community? What services do we have in place for same students who experience same-sex domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, if any? If we do not have those services, how do we fill that void? Where do we get someone qualified? What local organizations can we partner with? And then what do you desire to develop or expand? I think that as I consider myself an optimist, as I said, we work with so many wonderful campuses of all different sizes who are really looking out for the spirit of the law and what's best for their students. And what we want to continue to see happen is change or investment in programs by leadership. Often we see changes or so many changes being made after a complaint is filed. I think many of the institutions we've seen in the news have been making really tremendous changes, but it's because students have filed complaints. Activists have really pointed out possible problem areas. So I really think it's a challenge to other institutions to say, let's start to do this. And to the leadership of those institutions to say, we need to support our experts on campus doing this. We need to trust and listen to the folks in student conduct, in student affairs, in campus safety, security, and policing, to our victim advocates, and understand what we need to do. And there's power in numbers. If you're not getting the support, building that committee of the folks you know care about this and are working on this day to day, and saying, these are the things we need to do. This is where we have a void. We need help. We need someone to do advocacy on our campus. So identifying the needs and developing strategies for those, the needs of students, the needs of faculty, and the needs of administration. and then developing strategy for responding to those needs. So after you identify what the needs of each group are, how are you going what are the next steps? So what are the steps for ongoing education for students by VAWA? What are the next steps for our climate survey? I know we're seeing some pilots run on certain campuses, but do you have folks on your campus who can help create one? Is there data you can pull from your ACHA, your American College Health Association survey? Can you expand some of your other surveys? Because we also recognize that there is survey fatigue on campuses. So what surveys already exist, and can you add questions to fulfill or be a leader with those obligations? So we did a short video that's available on YouTube, and I want to identify the key pieces. We did a myth busting video because there are a lot of myths out there. And so the first myth we hear a lot is Campus Save pass and VAWA and Campus Save, or the Clery Act and Campus Save, or the Clery Act and VAWA are separate laws. And again, Campus Save did not formally pass. Informally, many people are calling Section 304 of the Violence Against Women Act, or the VAWA Amendments to Clery Act, SAVE. But it's not the SAVE Act any longer. So that's our informal reference to it. It's not the SAVE Act. And again, I would take pause if you're working with an organization or that's trying to pitch a product, and it may be a great product, if they're calling it SAVE compliant, because you don't have to be compliant with SAVE, because SAVE doesn't exist. So you want to be compliant with the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act, or Section 304 of the Clery Act. The second myth is I need to finalize everything by October 1st. And again, on May 29th, 2013, the Department of Education sent out a communication calling for this good faith effort. Try. All you can do is try. When you send your statistics in this year, try to indicate maybe you have some aggravated assaults that you want to go back in your crime log and say, were these in fact domestic violence, dating violence? How would we address that? How would we note that? How would we count that? And then you want to maybe do some sort of write-up of how you're doing that. In your annual security report, make notes. We are in the process of revising our policy. Our interim policy includes that dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, and then include if you're going to follow the same types of protocol that you have been following for sexual violence. If you're doing something already for dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, include that, because chances are, as I've said, you've probably had to respond to this. It's probably quite easy to think about what that response looks like. We have resources available. We have free webinars on our website that talk about the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. We have multiple recordings. The most recent we did as a technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women. We have a program called the Clery Center Collaborative, where colleges and universities join as teams of 5. So they're forced to create this committee of 5, and they go with us through this journey over the course of a year to talk about their challenges with Clery. You're provided with a self-assessment to assess your compliance on your own. So instead of bringing in a consultant and getting a report to sit on a shelf, you actually do the work. You can assess your own compliance with our checklist. And we worked with the Department of Education on creating this product. We got them to look at it and say, does this make sense? Will this help institutions? Will this help institutions that you've visited? You also get 3 in-person trainings, 5 online trainings that really your team can use. So we provide online Clery Act training. We also provide webinars throughout the year. So our next webinar that's coming up, we're having someone from the Office for Civil Rights talk about the FAQs. We've had folks talk about threat assessment, talk about timely warnings. And so it really gives you an opportunity to sit with your team, whether live on a webinar and ask questions, or to sit separately and work on it. But the goal of the program was we had so many people coming to our trainings, getting excited about really implementing things. And then they would go back and maybe not be as motivated or not have the support. So here's an opportunity to really get support, get buy-in, and work as a team. We also have an intersection conference on August 4th and 5th in Boston, and that's with Victims' Rights Law Center, where we're going to do a Clery training and then talk about the FAQs for Title IX. And then October 13th and 14th in our home area of Philadelphia, we have an intersection on Clery and Title IX. So we'll be talking about the VAWA amendments to Clery, some of the stalking components, hearing from panels of campuses of how they created a sexual assault response team, of how they created a coordinated community response. And then if you have questions, I'm going to go through the questions that have come in now, but I can see it's quite a few. So you can always reach out to me at akiss@clerycenter.org or my phone number there. I'm happy to talk with you as time permits, or if I'm not out of the office, and kind of listen to any follow-up you have or clarify anything for you. So some of the questions that we have, so it talks about, one is about geography. So there's questions about parking lots. Parking lots are typically, so this is a parking lot across the street from campus that is just an empty parking lot, is not owned or controlled. That's considered public property. If the parking lot is owned and controlled, if you have a guard there who checks cars as they go in, if you need a parking permit to park there, typically that's where we're talking about on campus. Another question was about reasonably contiguous. So I mentioned reasonably contiguous, and I talked about 1 to 2 miles. There's some discretion in what contiguous is, and I think it depends campus to campus. So something may be 2 miles away, and you may consider that non-campus property. And that's fine if it's 2 miles away and there are a bunch of houses in between, and depending on, it's all to your discretion there. Something may be a mile away, but that mile is just road. So you're calling that on campus still. So it really depends on your own geography. The copy of the presentation, many folks are asking for that. You will get PowerPoint slides, and you will also get a copy of the recorded presentation to listen to as often as you would like. Dating violence. So one of the questions about dating violence, or is a question about, what if we're a 2-year institution and we do not have residence halls? So you want to consider too that even though you do not have residence halls, you still may have incidents of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking that happen on your campus. And you do want to think about how you respond to them. Maybe you have the partner of a student picking him or her up from class and something happens and it's on your campus. You're required to respond then. The new categories of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, are they restricted to offenses occurring in Clery Geography? And the answer to that is yes. We're still talking about Clery Geography. However, Clery Geography, you also want to know that if a student reports or a faculty or staff member reports, you still may have to respond, even if you're not counting it in your statistics. So if it does not happen on your geography and it's not in your statistic, then you want to make sure that you have that. The question about the map. So you want to make sure too that you start to consider having a map. And that's one of the things that came up in the draft regulations. It talked about making sure you had a map that is able to identify your geography. And that's something that's always been a promising practice. Not Alone said it would give an example of MOUs with local police for investigation for sexual assaults by June 2014. Have these been released? I have not heard of them being released yet, but I know I've heard talk of them. So definitely keep an eye out for those memorandums of understanding, or start to look at maybe some of your other MOUs for how you can assist with that. There was a question about a transcript being provided. We do have someone who is doing closed caption services, and I can certainly follow up and see if we do have that transcript available, but I would guess that we will. Can we identify students as advocates? We have an established mentoring system that would lend itself to this. This is a question more kind of answered through the frequently asked questions for Title IX. So there was this kind of, if you have students who are trained and they're reporting to someone with privilege, you could identify them as advocates. So you just want to be clear and consistent with what you do. And Clery is the same way as well. If somebody has that privilege, if they're granted that privilege because of the role they serve and the training they've been through, be clear about that. Also look at if they serve other functions. So if you have a student acting as an advocate who's also a resident assistant, they have different roles with each of those. So you want to be clear on that. Okay, so one of the questions was about over-reporting. We know that under-reporting crimes can violate the Clery Act. How does over-reporting? And over-reporting can be a violation of the Clery Act. There's precedent for that. So you want to be sure that you have a system in place. If you develop anonymous and confidential reporting systems, you have a system in place to see or to be sure that you're not double counting or over counting. So make sure that you have. And again, this is where case studies can come into play to help you kind of build that. We are a small cosmetology institute with on-campus housing and about 200 students. Do all requirements you mentioned apply to us? This is where it's important to know if you are an institution that grants financial aid, then requirements do pertain to you. If you don't have housing with Clery, then you don't have to follow the missing students provision and the fire safety provisions that we didn't talk about today, but you do have to have something in place for the other pieces. Now, you may partner, and this is an opportunity to call your local rape crisis or your local domestic violence organization to see if there are things that you can do together. Will some of the upcoming trainings that we have include guidance on VAWA reportings? We do. We have some training coming up. I think we're holding one in California and Reno. We have included some of the guidance on VAWA reporting. We will probably have our training in Boston and in October because we will be farther along. I think the closer we get to final guidance, the more you will get, if that makes sense. But I think training is always good to think about even your good faith effort before the annual security report. So again, it's based most on your needs. Should we be changing the sex offense definitions to be in line with the consensus language for the 2014 annual security report? Again, you want to make that good faith effort. So it looks like from the statute too, that will go through. So make the effort for, and again, stating there that these are the changes you will be making. As I said, I think holding off on any kind of monumental change. So if you're going to put in place some educational program or a policy and say this is final as of October 1, 2014, you don't want to do that because the final regulations can change. It is possible. So again, making the good faith effort, and I would say base that off the statute. If you're a non-residential campus without campus law enforcement, where can we find resources to help? And that's where really partnerships. So partnerships for resources can certainly help you with compliance. One of the questions is about timely warnings. So timely warnings about sexual assaults. When you have a sexual assault, and there had been kind of these swirling rumors, I will call them, that you had to issue a timely warning for every sexual assault. That can be chilling. And what the law says and requires is that you evaluate every Clery Act crime for whether or not you issue a timely warning. May you withhold that warning? Absolutely. And you need to document why you withhold that warning. So if you withhold it because you have strong belief that it will identify the victim, document that. If you withhold that because you believe it may put the victim in more harm, which it might for dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, you document that. So you really want to be clear about how your decision was made and if you withheld, why you did that. The option not to report to campus police. So if you identify confidential resources, you don't want to identify those privileged resources as you don't want to identify the privileged resources as a place to report crimes because then they become people that have to report. But you just want to identify, here are confidential people who can help. Here are confidential people you can talk to. and almost creating, often we talk about having this quadrant of 4 squares. What happens if you report directly to law enforcement? What happens if you go to the counseling center? What happens if you don't want to report? You can wait and report later, but being very clear about that. We get a lot of reports of verbal only domestics. Do those need to be reported? And this is where it's important to keep track of what you're hearing. So we know about domestic violence and dating violence that it can escalate. And there was a lot of conversation around the draft regulations, physical and mental abuse. Is there a difference? Are they interchangeable? And so I think this is where it's important to have training on when you get reports, if they are verbal or only, of what type of options you will offer. And how you're going to track that, because chances are, again, based on the dynamics of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, is that unfortunately, they do often escalate. Does VAWA include when the victim is a male? And absolutely it does. It's called the Violence Against Women Act, but it does include if the victim is a male, if it is a same-sex case. Can the new reported crimes be considered hate crimes? It's certainly quite possible. And then the last question was, can you send a link to the YouTube video that you mentioned? We can certainly send it out with the slides and the recording of this webinar. So we can include that to you. It's also, I know, on our Twitter and Facebook page if you do use those. If not, we will certainly make sure it goes out to everyone who is in attendance on this webinar today. So just to close, you will receive the slides, you will receive the recording of this webinar. We will make sure you receive the YouTube video. I believe we've almost got through all the questions, but I did just find more. I'm going to go through a few more in the minute that we have left. What if a student is sexually assaulted after leaving a campus event? So while she and another student are on their way home. So it may not happen in your geography, and you may not need to report it on your geography, but if the student reports it to your campus, you do have obligations for the conduct process, for certain change of academic and living situation. So you want to, as soon as a student reports, even if it's not included in your crime statistics, there are other things that you want us to do. What other follow-ups do you recommend for sexual violence education? I think a comprehensive approach, like how are you going to do passive presenting? How are you going to hang signs? How are you going to do a poster campaign? What are things that you can do? I've seen a campus hang kind of the for sale type signs where they had statistics about sexual violence. Think about what works for you. Presenters, I would certainly say first and foremost, reach out to your local law enforcement. Somebody asked about their map. Can they use MapQuest or Google Maps? Absolutely. It's a great place to start to think about how you're going to get that information out there. Will we be putting together an updated webinar for Campus Security Authority training to include these amendments? Yes, we are committed as a group that advocated and provided training around the VAWA amendments. We are committed to provide some information on that, or ongoing information as we move forward with the final regulations. How do we apply for grants through the Office on Violence Against Women? That is through the Department of Justice. It typically is every March, but I've also heard it may be in October. When that call for grantees becomes public, we will certainly make sure it goes out, both because we are a technical assistance provider for OVW, but also for many of the stakeholders with whom we work. And so I think that is all the time. Unfortunately, I do see we have 50 or so more questions, but I know the webinar will shut down in another minute. If your question did not get answered, send it to me. I will make sure we get an answer for you. Just be patient, because if everybody who has a question looming sends it, it's just going to take a while, but I will certainly make a point to get to your question, if possible, by the end of the day today. I really thank you for your time and your commitment, and encourage you. We are a very approachable group to reach out if we can help you in any way. We're very good with social media, so we make sure to update anything that we have on Twitter and Facebook as needed. But again, we will continue to make sure we make information available to all of you as needed. But thank you very much again for joining. We know it's the end of the semester. We had a huge group today, so it was wonderful to have you engaged and for all your questions. And we look forward to working with you in the future or seeing you at events.